Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you this morning. Heard from Sister Annette Butler earlier this morning that her cousin, Yvonne King, is off the ventilator in Columbus, doing a little bit better. They're hoping to keep her off the ventilator. She is still in ICU, however. So do keep Sister Butler and her cousin in your prayers. Take your Bible and turn to the book of James. We're in chapter 5. And we had left off just introducing last week the next to the last part of James chapter 5, where James talks about being patient in the face of suffering. Now, you may remember in the first part of this chapter, he had dealt with the issue of wealth, and not just wealth per se, but particularly the misuse of it, the shameful use of it, and bad attitudes toward it. As James is writing to these Christians, primarily, at least initially, Jewish Christians, those who are his brethren in the flesh as well as in the Lord, he's dealing with folks who are naturally going to struggle somewhat with their past perspectives. Now, we're all, to some degree, products of our upbringing and background, aren't we? These Jewish Christians were no different. We can go back and look at the background of some of the issues and conflicts in the book of Acts that these early first-generation Christians had to contend with, and how that some of the things were imposed from outside the body. They had to contend with the changing attitudes of neighbors and family and community as we go from Acts chapter 2 to Acts chapter 8, how that at the end of chapter 2 we saw that they had favor with all the people. Their faithfulness, their spirituality and so forth seemed very commendable. We get to Acts chapter 8, and what do we find? Well, now the Jewish community, particularly in Jerusalem and Judah, has figured out, oh, wait a minute. This Christianity thing is not just a new commitment to Judaism, to the law of Moses. It's something different. And they go from having favor with all the people to being persecuted by the rulership. We find that it's not long until Herod and Pilate, being on the same page, James winds up being beheaded, Peter winds up being imprisoned and then delivered. But then, what else do we encounter? Among the Christians themselves, as the gospel begins to expand, just as Jesus had said in Acts chapter 1, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, uttermost parts of the earth, as the message begins to spread into the outside parts, the uttermost parts of the earth, now some of these Jewish Christians begin to be uncomfortable with the differences that they see between themselves and some of their new brethren. And so we come to Acts chapter 15, and we have this whole conflab that takes place at Jerusalem, because what had happened? Some had come from Jerusalem to Antioch and basically said, look, you new Christians, you have to become proselytes. You have to keep the law of Moses. You have to be circumcised. You have to observe our dietary requirements and so forth. And of course that was answered in Acts chapter 15. But we come to Acts chapter 20, and even so, some of the Jewish Christians still, even there, are still very unsure of themselves in their faith, I guess you'd say. because the Talmudic law is so ingrained in them. They're so accustomed to living and thinking in a certain way and from a certain perspective. James writes this letter much as Paul writes the letter to the Galatians, dealing, James perhaps less directly than Paul, but dealing nonetheless with the issue of whether or not it's required for Christians to observe those, from the Jewish perspective, those niceties of Jewish tradition. And James makes the point you can't have faith apart from works, where Paul, in dealing with the Galatian Christians, has to make a slightly different point. You can't have works of the law, Old Testament law, Talmudic law, on top of faith. Martin Luther in the 1500s looks at Paul's letter to the Romans, the letter to the Galatians, and so forth, and keys in on the concepts of grace and faith. And then he comes to the book of James and doesn't see how to reconcile the two, because James very plainly teaches faith plus works. Luther's misunderstanding was to read every instance of works as Old Testament works, justification by the law. And neither Paul nor James taught that. But James very emphatically says, you have to practice your faith. You have to practice, you have to act out your faith. And we come down here to chapter 5, and in this first paragraph, talking about material wealth and riches, he's dealing with something that, for the Jewish background of these Christians, posed a little bit of a challenge to their thinking. Because what was the traditional, the Talmudic perspective on a Jew who was materially well off? That he must be obeying God. He must be doing something right. God must be pleased with him, exactly, because God's blessing him. Go back to before there were Jews and Gentiles, all the way to what might very well be the first book of the Bible actually written down, which would be Job. And what's the whole contention of Job's friends with Job and his hardships? Exactly, Paul. Job, you must have done some kind of horrible sin for God to visit this kind of misery and suffering on you. And what was Job's contention all along? Well, I'm not perfect, but I certainly haven't done anything to merit this level of misery. And in the end, what do we find? Well, Job is vindicated. He had not done anything that merited that level of misery. But that didn't stop the traditional perspective. Go to John chapter 9 and look at the first couple of verses. And Jesus and his disciples encounter a man who was blind from birth. And what is the assumption that his disciples make and ask him about? Somebody must have sinned for this man to be born blind. Now, the only question is, was it the man himself? Which that really doesn't make sense, because how could he have sinned in the womb so as to be born blind? Or was it his parents? And that's kind of the implication here. His parents must have done something to merit this. And yet, how does Jesus reply? This man was born blind, not because as a result of sin, but so that the power of God can be demonstrated. Well, here, chapter 5 and verses 1 through 6, James talks about wealth, material prosperity. And the point that he makes here is that these individuals, whether Christians or Jewish leadership, these individuals need to understand the proper perspective. Earthly material wealth is not, number one, it's not proof that God is pleased with you. How many unrighteous people are prosperous in this world's goods? Think about the rich man and Lazarus. They did not wind up on the same side of eternity. But beyond that, they need to understand in Christ that these material things, they're temporary in the first place. That's not what life is all about. And having made that point, he then comes down here to verses 7 through 12 and talks about patience in the face of suffering. Patience in the face of suffering. Now, why would James need to talk about this with these Christians? Okay, they're waiting for the Lord's return. Some of them may be waiting for the Lord's return like, well, we're waiting, Lord, come on, any day now. But, okay, go back to Acts chapter 8. What had led up to the circumstances of Acts 15 and the condition in Acts 20 where there's still some uncertainty and so forth? Acts chapter 8. Jewish leadership, Jewish family perhaps, persecuting Christians. As we see the kingdom expand out into the Gentile world, what kind of reception does the gospel get from some of the pagan people? Well, let's think about the reaction of Demetrius and the silversmiths at Ephesus and so forth. It wasn't very friendly in some situations, was it? Think about Paul and Barnabas and then later Paul and Silas going through Asia Minor or modern day Turkey, place to place to place to place. And where did Paul typically go every time he came to a new town? Where did he start? In the synagogue, and if there wasn't a synagogue like at Philippi, he would go to wherever the local Jewish community tended to meet for prayer. He would reach out first to those folks with whom he had a natural connection. But how did that go down with some of those Jewish communities in the Gentile world? Yeah. Go to Thessalonica, and not only was he not well received by the Jewish community there, moves on to Berea, and we read in Acts 17 that they were more noble than the folks at Thessalonica, more fair-minded. But some of the Jews from Thessalonica began to pursue him place to place. They took time and money and effort to dog his steps and try to tear down what he was doing. How many times would Saul of Tarsus / Paul the Apostle end up being arrested, being hassled, being threatened, being beaten, being slandered, all for preaching the gospel? Well, that almost becomes the soundtrack of his life as a Christian, doesn't it? And so James, writing to these Jewish Christians in the face of rising opposition, says in 7 through 12, be patient, brethren. Be patient. Go back to chapter 4 for just a second. And what was the warning in chapter 4? In chapter 4, what causes quarrels and fights among you? Your passions at war within you. And then later on in chapter 4, you don't know what's coming tomorrow. Don't think only in material terms. Verses 13, 14, 15, 16. Don't focus on your material wealth. Chapter 5, 1 through 6, that's not proof that God approves of what you're doing. Be patient. In other words, he's writing to Christians who, if they're going to maintain faith in Christ, have to confront the very real prospect, not just a possibility, but a likelihood that their faith is going to cost them something. Be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Patience in the face of suffering. That word patient means long-tempered. Hold your frustration in check. How many of us have taught children to hold their temper? It's not an easy thing to do sometimes, is it? Have you ever been deliberately provoked? Had somebody deliberately, intentionally trying to push your buttons and make you turn loose of your self-control? If you're a parent, you have. If you're a sibling, you almost certainly have. That younger sister or that older sister, that brother, oh, they know exactly what buttons to push, don't they? Sally, don't look at your brother. Don't look at your brother now. She's planning against you, brother. After all these years, she's still planning some mischief. No, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The coming here is as in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7, the appearing of the Lord. We're not talking about final judgment here necessarily, but at the time that James is writing, what's the time frame we've looked at here? Roughly speaking, somewhere around 50 A.D., thereabouts, give or take a couple of years. What's in the near future for Judaism? Destruction of Jerusalem. The end of the nation as a nation. The end of Jewish religion centered around the temple. Think about this, brethren. Since 70 A.D., how many sacrifices have been offered in Judaism? None that we know of. How many days of atonement have been observed in full? None that we can document. How many Passover lambs have been sacrificed? Since 70 A.D., how many years of Jubilee have been observed? How since 70 A.D., how many high priests have been recognized from among their brethren in Judaism? Now, there may have been a few acknowledged by some between 70 and about 135 when the Bar Kokhba rebellion took place and the Jews were formally and I guess you could say officially scattered into the Roman Empire. But Judaism as it exists in the world today is an adaptation at best, a human adaptation religiously of what it was in the first century. And the Judaism as it was practiced in the first century, even in Judah, even in Jerusalem, was orders of magnitude different than it had been before captivity. James writes to these Jewish Christians, many of whose struggles in their faith seem to be rooted not so much in understanding the gospel as in understanding the relationship between the law of Moses that they had previously lived under and the Talmudic interpretation of it, and its relationship to the law of Moses. Trying to understand, we've moved from this to this instead of just adding this on top of this. You're not adding Christ on top of Moses. You're moving from Moses to Christ. What had Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 and verse 17? I came to fulfill. How many times in the book of Matthew do we find Jesus saying, or Matthew telling us that something happened that it might be fulfilled, which was written in the law or in the prophets or in the Psalms? That it might be fulfilled. Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy, but to complete. So these Jews who have become Christians, they struggle with understanding their times. And James says, be patient until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the rain. Now, think about this for a minute. What can a farmer do to make it rain? There you go. Pray. Does that make it rain? No, not necessarily. God does answer prayer. Sometimes God says no, and sometimes God says not yet. But the farmer doesn't control the rain. If James is writing about the year 50 AD, then the coming of the Lord that Jesus described in Matthew 24, verse 3 down to about verse 35, that's still about 20 years away, isn't it? The judgment, the coming of the Lord in judgment on Jerusalem. Think about the perspective that James is presenting to these Jewish Christians. Now, how many of them understand at this point what's going to take place? How the Lord is going to come in that scenario? Well, that's 20 years off in the future. None of them understand it to any great degree. Imagine how they would think about this if they could know, 17, 18, 19, 20 years from now, the Lord is going to let the Romans demolish the temple and the city and put an end to the service of the priesthood and so forth. What would that do to their faith? Even as Christians, that would be hard to swallow, wouldn't it? Imagine if you knew that in 2050, our nation would be overwhelmed and conquered by somebody else. How would that affect the way you live now? Well, you might obsess about that. Be patient, verse 7. The message is, you, brethren, are not in control of these events. God is. There is an application, a lesson for us in that. In our religious environment, how many people fascinated with prophecies and things that they read in the scriptures try to manipulate circumstances to bring something about? Most of the time something that has long since already transpired, but their understanding is we can help God make this happen. The whole dispensational movement in Protestantism is built on that thought. Dale, you had a comment. Mm-hmm.
Verse 3 says, and as he's talking to Jesus,
Yeah.
and he's prophesying, he said, and as he said upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him, saying, tell us, when shall these things be?
Mm-hmm.
And what shall be the sign of thy coming?
Yeah.
He goes on to add the end of the world, which is a different subject.
Right.
But there's two questions here that
Mm-hmm.
you also ask.
Yeah.
The sign and then of thy coming, and when shall these things be?
Yep. Yeah.
But the Jews understood this language better than what maybe even we. And if you look in Mark 13,
Mm-hmm.
they ask you when the signs and
Yeah.
when shall these things be fulfilled.
Yep.
And then in Luke 21, it says when shall these things come to pass?
Yeah.
All relative. But if you turn over to Isaiah, the 13th chapter, they understood this language, again, better than we do to some extent, because this language is used for kingdoms to be taken over.
Exactly.
Changed over, and it's a little bit of a reading. But if you turn over to Isaiah, the 13th chapter,
Okay, Isaiah chapter 13. And your point.
about the destruction of Babel,
Exactly.
and that's where it comes.
Your point is well taken in that respect, that the people Jesus was speaking to in Matthew 24, the folks that James is writing to here, their background it equips them to understand this terminology, to recognize that Jesus or James is talking about nations rising and falling according to the will of God. Go ahead in Isaiah 13. Mm-hmm.
Which Isaiah, the son of Amos, did see. Lift ye up a banner unto a high mountain, exalt the voice to them, shake the hand, that they may go into the gates of the nobles. I have commanded my sanctified ones, I have also called my mighty ones for my anger, even them that rejoiced in my name.
Mm-hmm.
The noise of the multitude in the mountain, like as of a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts mustereth the host of the battle. Who gathered?
Exactly.
Some people say that Persians and the Medes, but God said, I did.
Well, and 200 and some odd years before Ezekiel would tell, or before Daniel would tell Nebuchadnezzar, what is Isaiah foretelling here? Exactly the same thing that Daniel would tell Nebuchadnezzar in that time in Daniel 4. God rules in the kingdoms of men.
Of the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land.
Yeah,
How ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand.
exactly.
And it shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore shall all hands be faint, and every man's heart shall melt. That's exactly what he told in Matthew 24.
Precisely.
And they shall be afraid, pains and sorrows shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. There again, Matthew 24.
Very much.
They shall be amazed one at another, the face shall be as flames. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not see light to shine.
Exactly.
A lot of the same language that Christ uses and recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and even when Christ was crucified. You go back and you look, darkness was
Exactly.
Luke says all
The whole world. Yeah. Which, by the way, shows us it's not a naturally occurring eclipse. Point well taken. You know, we often make the point that John, the apostle, in writing not just the gospel record and his brief letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, but especially the Revelation, we look at primarily Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah as the quarry, you might say, from which he mines his figures and his illustrations. And that to a large degree is true, but we overlook the point that Jesus does in his teaching the very same thing that John does. Jesus reaches back into the prophetic passages of the Old Testament where Isaiah and others are prophesying for their people in their time about their circumstances, and he uses those illustrations and those images that would have been so familiar to the Jews of his day to make his point about them and their circumstances. Here in Isaiah 13, 1 through, what was that, about 12, thereabouts, Isaiah presents a whole series of images that Jesus then draws on in Matthew 24 in the part of the chapter where he's answering the first of the questions. When shall these things be? Well, when you see all of these things coming to pass, you know God is coming in judgment on his people. Well, what's the sign of that day? God's not going to give you a sign. He's giving you a warning. Be ready, and then it doesn't matter when it comes. Come over here to James chapter 5 now. And what does James do? Be patient. Establish your hearts. Verse 8, be stout-hearted. Be confirmed in your faith, as it were. Steve, our slides are not advancing again. So, the Lord is at hand, he says. Well, that word at hand has the idea of impending. It doesn't mean immediate, but it means near, close by. The Lord is at hand. Now, in this context, if James is talking of the impending destruction, judgment, if you will, of national Judah, then what is this statement in verse 8? The Lord is at hand. If you're going to be persecuted, you're going to have your faith challenged and tested, know this. There we go. Know this, it's only for a time. Your rescue, if you will, is coming. So be patient. Now, come down to verse 9. Don't grumble. Don't murmur against one another. Here's an appeal. Here is an admonition. Don't find fault with your brethren. In Matthew 25, in 31 to 46, the judgment scene there, what distinguishes the sheep from the goats? They had the same opportunities presented before them. You saw me naked and sick and hungry and afflicted and in prison and so forth. When did we ever see you like that? Both of them have the same response. When did we ever see that? Inasmuch as you did or didn't do it to these, the least of my brethren. You did or didn't do it to me. Well, don't find fault with each other. Don't find fault among yourselves. Think about Job's friends. Do you want friends like Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar in your hour of trial? I think I could do without friends like that. You want to talk about fair weather friends? They seem to be the definition of it. Don't find fault among yourselves, and don't find fault with God. Think about this, brethren. What are we saying? What are we implying? When something bad, unpleasant, unhappy, sorrow-making happens in our lives, and our response to that is, well, where was God when? What does that imply? Where was God when this bad thing, when this unhappy thing, when this thing that made me sad, where was God when this happened? That's implying that, well, God ignored me. God didn't care about me. God didn't pay attention to me. That's not true, is it? That's never been true. So, come down then to verses 11 and 12, 10, 11, and 12. As an example of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Think about the prophets. Go over to Hebrews chapter 11 and start at about verse 33 and notice there what the Hebrews writer says about the prophets in the hall of fame of the faithful, as we usually call it, there in Hebrews chapter 11. He says at verse 32, "What more shall I say? Time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war," and on and on and on and on. There we go. Now go back to Matthew chapter 5. In the Sermon on the Mount, you look at verses 12 and 13. And what does Jesus say there? Just before he gets to, "You're the salt of the earth and the light of the world," the lead into that statement in the Sermon on the Mount is what? Well, you look at verses 12 and 13. "Rejoice and be glad. Great is your reward in heaven. They persecuted the prophets before you." So, writing to these Christians, James counsels patience, long-suffering. Recognize that your timetable and God's are not necessarily the same thing. And then he goes from the prophets in verse 10 to Job in verse 11. "We consider blessed those who have remained steadfast." You've heard of the patience, the steadfastness of Job. And you've seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Well, how do you see the purpose of the Lord? Look at the life of Job. Two passages in Job to think about. The last verse of Job chapter 1 says what about Job in the beginnings of his sufferings? Before God even turns Satan loose to afflict him bodily, he's lost his children, he's lost his wealth, he's lost his servants. It's just been calamity after calamity after calamity after calamity in Job chapter 1. And you look at, I think it's verse 21, the last verse. In all this, Job did not do what? Job didn't blame God. He didn't charge God foolishly. He didn't lay the blame at God. He didn't say, "Well, where was God when this happened to me?" And then we have a similar statement near the end of chapter 2. Think about Job, James says. All right, think about Job. He had much greater sufferings on a personal level than any of us is ever likely to endure. Go to Job chapter 42, and the verse is about verse 10, thereabouts. What does God tell us about Job there? The Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than the beginning. Isn't it ironic that I am the ever-present God who sees the end from the beginning and the beginning from the end, the one who is in the eternal present? Isn't it just deliciously ironic that he counsels us, we who cannot see the end from this moment, be patient because I can. Trust that the end will be all right, that I will take care of the end. Now, come down then to verse 12, and the conclusion to this line of thinking is this little one-statement paragraph. Above all, my brethren, do not swear. That comes in a context of moments of trial. Do not swear. Now, the swearing here it has no reference to a judicial oath. In most courts nowadays, if you're asked to give evidence or to take an oath, there is alternative wording. Do you solemnly swear or affirm? Or sometimes it'll say promise. Well, why? Oh, Christians are not supposed to swear. I can't take I'm not supposed to swear. Well, that is true. You're not supposed to swear in this context. But this context has nothing to do with a judicial promise to tell the whole truth or to bear true faith and allegiance or anything of that sort. In fact, the idea of an oath to tell the truth is, in a court of law, is something of comparatively recent vintage. It doesn't go back to this era per se. So when James says, do not swear, it's in the context of passages like where Jesus takes the Jews to task in Matthew 23 and says, you hold someone accountable who swears an oath by the gold of the temple, but if he just swears by the temple itself, that's a minor thing, and if he doesn't keep that promise, well, that's no big deal. Here, James is talking about oaths that would cause a man to perjure himself, which is what Jesus was talking about there. You take this vow, I swear I'll do this, or I swear I won't do that, and then you go on and do it because, well, it's just a minor oath anyway. No, don't swear at all. Let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. In other words, speak straightforwardly. Your yes and your no should be exactly what they purport to be. That gets to a practice of the Jewish culture that Jesus was talking about there in Matthew 23, where the oath that had a financial component, that was far more serious in their thinking than one that didn't. And yet, Jesus makes the point that a broken oath is perjury. You've sworn you'll do something, say something, bear true faith and allegiance, so to speak, and you've not done it. And so these things ought not to be characteristic. That kind of behavior ought not to be characteristic of Christians. Again, go back to the behavior patterns, the thinking that was familiar to these Jewish Christians, not as Christians, but as Jews. They need to understand there are some differences, some distinctions to be made between their former life as Jews and their current life as Christians. Well, I thought we would conclude this morning, but we'll take one more week and wind up the last little tidbit of James next week, God willing. I appreciate your comments and your participation. Thank you very much. And we'll finish this next week.